Good day, and welcome to this introductory session on the Gospel of John. For the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be doing a recorded video of a Bible study on the book of, or the Gospel of John. I'm going to try to do it in one take each time, so it seems natural and it seems kind of real. And if I mess up, I'll try to either correct it in the comments or correct it on the next video. But I wanted to take this time because I know we're all busy right now. And a Bible study in the evening might not always work for everybody. So the design of this is that you can go and watch it whenever you want. It will be several weeks long. And the hope is to look through the entire Gospel of John from chapter 1 all the way to the end of the Gospel. So it's going to be a bit comprehensive, but I will not get to every single portion of the scripture texts because that would be really difficult to fine tune and to look at everything. So if a question comes up during the midst of the study, you could either email me directly or you can put a comment underneath in the comments area, and I will try to get to it either by responding to the comment or by including it if it's kind of a larger topic in the next video. So why the Gospel of John? Well, one, I'm going to be up front. I am studying this in my Doctorate of Ministry course right now, and I thought it would be fun to kind of learn alongside each other. I'm going to be learning some new things. As I had learned in Romans, I learned all sorts of new things, but I wanted to share those with you. And for a lot of people, reading the entire gospel is not something that they've done before, so I'm going to kind of mix it with introductory portions of the video and then a little bit deeper dives into the scripture texts. There are two resources that I will be using primarily. These are actually my class texts, and that is one, it just is called John by Gail O'Day and Susan Hyland, and it kind of looks like that if you want to pick it up. And the second one is called Word of Life, the Theology of John's Gospel by Craig Koester. And it looks like that. The other reason why I really wanted to dive into John is I was raised in an atheist kind of household, agnostic household. And I came to know Christianity through my pastors, through a day camp. That's a long story that doesn't need to be shared, but one of the introductory texts that I was given was the Gospel of John to learn about who Jesus was. And so the Gospel of John meant a lot to me. And then as I kind of grew in spirituality and in faith, I realized I was more of a Gospel of Luke type pastor. And the Gospel of John presented a Jesus that was kind of floating above other people, as I like to call it. A Jesus that was more spiritual, more mystical, more anything. And so I started to kind of fall out of that initial love of the gospel. And then the more and more I dove into the Gospel of John, I saw how actually physical and tangible Jesus is in the Gospel of John. Yes, he does not do as many kind of big miracles. In fact, he only does 7 of them in the Gospel, and he preaches a lot in John. But you can't argue that Jesus is flesh and blood in the Gospel of John. It is a very tangible, very earthly, very at parts gory Jesus. Jesus is going to get dirty. Jesus is going to be present in the midst of community. And so what was initially a love of John and then kind of a falling away from John has returned to a kind of love of John. And so I wanted to present this class for those that have never read the gospel, but also maybe are struggling with the text, to show how I fell back in love with the Gospel of John. I am still a Luke guy, I'm not going to deny that, but the Gospel of John is number 2 for me. as we're looking through the text, and this is really just the introductory, so next week we'll do chapter 1 of John, there's just a few things to note. The first is, the original thought was that this gospel was written well after Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Mark is generally thought to be the first gospel written, about 30 years or so, 20 to 30 years after Jesus' death. And then Matthew and Luke were thought to be written at the same exact time, with John coming way later. And a lot of people still hold on to that. One of the things that O'Day brought up is that there was a papyrus found in Egypt which contained aspects of the Gospel of John, and it was dated at 125, which means that it would place the Gospel actually at the same time as Matthew and Luke's Gospel, rather than a way off Gospel. And so there's been this kind of new idea that the Gospel of John had Mark to rely on, and maybe Matthew and Luke were just starting to form, but it wanted to be its own thing. It wanted to look at Jesus and tell the Jesus narrative in its own unique way. And so some of the teachings was that John was kind of a supplement to the other Gospels, but it's not really a supplement. It is its own narrative. It's its own story of Jesus and how Jesus interacted with the community and with the people. So as you're reading through it, just kind of look and see, how does Jesus talk and how does Jesus interact? As I said, there is a lot of talking in Jesus. It's really dialogue centric and dialogue heavy rather than miracle centric. And so Jesus is going to talk with people. And watch what that talking does to people. One of the themes that you're going to see is that the way that the word is passed is from one person to the other person to the other person. And so, like in early John, when there's the disciples, John the Baptist is going to point to Jesus. And from that pointing, two of the disciples are going to show up and start to follow Jesus. And then one of them is going to go get another one. And that's how things are going to continue. People talk about Jesus after Jesus has interacted with them. The other major theme is light and dark. You're going to hear that throughout a lot of the text. And just a note on that, for the scripture writer, the idea of darkness was where kind of hiddenness was, where big questions were asked, where you didn't want to be seen by the community. In more recent years, the idea of darkness took on this idea that somehow darkness was bad or darkness was evil, but that wasn't the intent. Darkness is where the heavy stuff happens. It's where God works. It's where the deeper wrestling with God happens. And so Nicodemus visiting Jesus happens in the dark, where he's going to ask, but also want to stay hidden from the rest of his community. So pay attention to light, darkness, knowledge, and not knowing, all kind of themes that we'll talk about next week a little bit. But there is one major topic that I wanted to talk about right in the introduction, and that's anti-Semitism in the Gospel of John. There is a teaching that John's language is really harsh against the Jews, and I'm not putting the Jews in quotes as if they don't exist, but actually a quote from the gospel text, how John refers to the Jewish leaders, or the Judeans to be more specific. And so there's been this idea that John was anti-Semitic in his writing. There has been anti-Semitic ways of using John. I am not going to deny that. Christians throughout the centuries have used John in such a way to push down Jewish people and to pretend as if they were somehow less than. I am not going to argue that at all. Christians, though, were the ones that did that. John himself, the writer of the gospel, or the school that wrote after him, was Jewish. Jesus is very much Jewish. In fact, the church in and of itself at that time of the writing of the gospel wouldn't have called themselves Christians. They probably would have called themselves the Way or some other kind of, there were multiple names of followers of Jesus, but they were Jewish or Jesus loving Jewish people. So who the gospel writer is writing to is this Jesus loving Jewish people as well as Jewish people. And he himself is Jewish, and Jesus does a lot of things during Jewish festivals. And so was the gospel writer anti-Semitic? No. But has it been used that way? Yes. But John's language is harsh. And the reason why it was harsh is there was an infighting between the Jewish leaders at the time, or Judeans, you'll hear me kind of switch that language here and there. So that's when John says the Jews, or fear of the Jews, he's talking about the leaders in particular who were persecuting Jesus-loving Jewish people because they were becoming a subsect and a threat to their way of life in the midst of Roman culture. So don't forget, Rome is the center of everything. They were kind of tolerant of Jewish people there. But what was happening is Jewish people would not bend the knee to Caesar. They only focused on God, which was a threat to Rome. And now all of a sudden you have these Jesus-loving Jewish people who also include Gentiles, who also include non-Jewish people, who are also not bending the knee to Rome, so to speak. And so there was a feeling of threatening feeling between these two groups, because if Rome has decided, yeah, we're not going to tolerate people anymore, that's the end of the Jewish people. And so there was this infighting between Jewish people and Jesus-loving Jewish people. And so John is talking to his own people. And I often say, if you're fighting with your family, sometimes your language is harsher than it would be if you were fighting with a stranger. And so there is some serious infighting right now between the Jewish leaders, the Judeans, the main Jewish church, and then this subsect of Jesus-loving Jewish people who still identify as being Jewish, but really are followers of Jesus, and they're fighting with one another. The main Jewish leaders are trying to stop this subsect from existing. And so the fight means life or death for sometimes. And so the language becomes harsh. And there really was a fear that was planted in there, because what would happen is persecutions would start with the Jewish leaders persecuting Jesus-loving Jewish people. And then as Christianity became, Rome would start coming after Christians. And so there was a life or death consequence. So when John is writing and he says, oh, there was fear of the Jews, he was meaning literally that there was fear for the disciples. But let's go back to the main question. Was it anti-Semitic? No. But people like Luther, and I'm Lutheran, this is the Lutheran church that I'm preaching out of, people like Luther used John to just badmouth Jewish people. There was this mentality that Christians had the right way and Jewish people were presented with a covenant and just blew it, and therefore Christianity took over as the right way. That is very much a 15th century mentality, although it still exists to this day in some denominations. Lutherans have written off Luther's anti-Semitic writings and in fact disavowed them and said, we recognize that they are present, but they do not represent us anymore. But as I said, some Christians still use John in this way. We will not, because I don't think John was ever meant to be an anti-Semitic text, but was talking about a situation that was very real in the life of the early Jesus-loving Jewish people. And so as we hear some of that language, take that to heart, that this wasn't meant to be against the modern day Jewish people, but was an infight between people that were family. And so they were fighting with family. So next week, we'll begin with chapter 1. So I hope you'll look at chapter 1 as an overture to the rest of the gospel. We'll see you next week.